Fire Captain Engineering, situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
In the fall of 1966, a small, underfunded science fiction show quietly premiered on American television. It had no major stars, a special effects budget that would embarrass a modern student film, and a network that was already lukewarm about its chances. Nobody involved could have predicted that this show would eventually spawn a dozen spin-off series, 13 feature films, an entire language invented for a fictional warrior race, and a cultural vocabulary so deep that phrases like "beam me up" and "live long and prosper" would outlive the century in which they were coined. That show was Star Trek, and behind its optimistic vision of a united, spacefaring humanity is a production history full of near misses, budget hacks, network battles, and strange behind-the-scenes moments that most fans have never heard. These are 20 weird, true facts about the original 1966 Star Trek that reveal just how close the entire franchise came to never existing at all. Television networks almost never commission a second pilot. If the first one fails to impress, the project usually dies quietly and everyone moves on. Star Trek is one of the rare exceptions, and the story of why reveals just how unusual the show was from the very beginning. The first pilot, titled The Cage, was delivered to NBC in early 1965. Studio executives watched it and came back with a verdict that would sound familiar to any writer who has ever pitched something too ambitious for the room. It was too slow, too philosophical, and too heavy on ideas rather than action. There was also a specific complaint about the ship's second-in-command, a stoic, highly capable female officer known only as Number One. Some executives reportedly felt that audiences of the era would not accept a woman in that kind of command role, week after week. By the ordinary rules of the television business, that should have been the end of it. Instead, NBC did something almost unheard of. They commissioned a second pilot, giving the production a rare opportunity to rebuild the show almost from scratch. Out went the somber tone and the original commanding officer. In came a punchier, more adventurous energy, a new captain, and a format built for weekly episodic storytelling rather than the single, dense feature-length experiment. Without that second chance, the entire franchise as we know it simply would not exist. The face most associated with the Starship Enterprise very nearly belonged to someone else entirely. In that first, rejected pilot, the commanding officer was Captain Christopher Pike, played by actor Jeffrey Hunter, a performer best known at the time for dramatic film roles. Hunter brought a serious, restrained intensity to the part, closer to a brooding military officer than the adventurous risk-taker audiences would later come to know. When the network ordered a second pilot, producers hoped Hunter would return. He did not. The exact reasons remain murky even decades later. Some accounts suggest his wife discouraged him from committing to a television series, viewing it as a step down from film work. Other accounts suggest Hunter himself simply lost interest in continuing with the project. Whatever the true reason, the role went back into casting, and this time it landed with a theatrical, energetic young actor who approached the character completely differently. That actor was William Shatner, and the shift in tone he brought to the captain's chair changed the entire personality of the show. Where Hunter's Pike was contemplative and withdrawn, Shatner's Kirk was bold, impulsive, and magnetic, a captain who led with instinct as much as intellect. It is difficult to imagine the franchise's decades of cultural momentum built around a quieter, more cerebral commanding officer. Tragically, Hunter never saw what the franchise became. He died in 1969, just 3 years after Star Trek premiered, at only 42 years old. The character cut from that first pilot deserves more attention than she usually gets. Number One, the unflappable, logic-driven first officer originally played by actress Majel Barrett, was one of television's earliest attempts at putting a woman in a position of real authority on a starship bridge. Network executives balked, and the character was removed from the show's command structure entirely when the second pilot was produced. Barrett did not disappear from the project, however. She was brought back in a different role, as the ship's medical officer, Nurse Christine Chapel, a part with far less authority than the one originally written for her. What makes this footnote even stranger is what happened decades later. Barrett went on to marry series creator Gene Roddenberry, and she would go on to lend her voice to the onboard computer system across multiple Star Trek series and films for the rest of her life, meaning the disembodied voice guiding Starfleet officers through generations of adventures belonged to the same actress whose command role had once been quietly written out of existence. Few characters in television history are as visually iconic as Mr. Spock, with his pointed ears, arched eyebrows, and calm, unreadable expression. But the earliest design concepts for the character described something considerably more sinister. Roddenberry's original notes and early concept sketches envisioned Spock with a reddish, almost devilish skin tone, intended to make him feel genuinely alien and unsettling rather than simply exotic. Practical reality intervened before that vision made it to screen. In 1966, the overwhelming majority of American households still owned only black and white television sets. A reddish skin tone would have rendered as an unervingly dark, almost black tint under monochrome broadcast, sending a visual message the production never intended. The design team pivoted to a much subtler yellowish-green tone, alien enough to register as otherworldly, but light enough not to cause confusion or discomfort on black and white screens. The final irony is that when color televisions eventually became standard, that carefully considered skin tint turned out to be so understated that most viewers barely noticed it. It was the ears, the eyebrows, and the character's unshakable logic that ended up carrying the alien identity, not the skin tone the production had worried over so extensively. One of the most recognizable gestures in all of pop culture, the raised hand split between the middle and ring fingers accompanied by the phrase, "Live long and prosper," was not written into any script. Actor Leonard Nimoy created it himself, improvising it on set based on a memory from his childhood. Nimoy grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family, and as a boy he witnessed a ceremonial blessing performed by Kohanim, members of the priestly class, during a synagogue service. In that ritual, the hands are held in a similar split-fingered formation as a blessing is recited, a gesture participants are traditionally taught not to look directly at because it is considered a moment charged with spiritual significance. Nimoy adapted that shape for Spock, giving the Vulcan greeting a quiet resonance that most viewers never knew was rooted in centuries-old religious tradition. It has since become one of the most widely recognized hand gestures in the world, deployed everywhere from tech keynote stages to postage stamps. Today, it is nearly impossible to separate the name Nimoy from the character of Spock, but in the earliest stages of production, Nimoy was genuinely uncertain whether he wanted the part at all. His primary concern was the prosthetic ears and the alien skin treatment. He worried the look might tip over from intriguing alien into something closer to a rubber-suited monster, the kind of role that could permanently typecast him in low-budget genre work rather than serious acting. There was also a deeper performance challenge buried in the character. Nimoy was a trained, expressive actor, and Spock demanded almost the opposite. A character who suppressed nearly all outward emotion, who reasoned rather than reacted, and whose most dramatic moments had to be conveyed through the smallest shifts in tone or expression rather than big, theatrical choices. It required him to essentially rebuild his acting instincts from the ground up. What eventually won him over, and what kept him committed to the role for the rest of his life, was the audience's response. Rather than seeing a cold or frightening figure, viewers responded to the quiet warmth beneath Spock's logic, the sense of a character wrestling internally with emotions he refused to show. Nimoy's own complicated relationship with the role is perfectly captured in the titles of his two autobiographies. The first, released in the 1970s, was called I Am Not Spock. The second, published decades later, was called I Am Spock. The distance between those two titles tells the whole story of a man who spent a lifetime making peace with the character that would outlive him. Ask any longtime fan to name the show's most iconic piece of technology, and the transporter usually tops the list. The idea of dissolving a human body into energy and reassembling it somewhere else feels like a bold conceptual leap, the kind of idea a visionary writer dreams up specifically to explore the philosophical questions of identity and consciousness. The truth is far less romantic. The transporter exists because the production could not afford to show a spaceship landing. The original plan called for the crew to travel to planetary surfaces the traditional science fiction way, flying a shuttlecraft down through a planet's atmosphere and showing the full descent, and landing on screen. Visually, this would have looked spectacular. Financially, it was completely out of reach for a modestly budgeted 1960s television production. The production team needed something cheaper and, crucially, something they could shoot quickly on a standing set rather than building elaborate landing sequences every week. Their solution was to have actors simply vanish from one location and reappear in another, using a visual effect built from glittering particles filmed against a dark backdrop and layered with reversed footage and lighting effects. It cost a fraction of what a full shuttle landing sequence would have required, and it could be reused, episode after episode, without ever looking repetitive because the effect itself was so striking. A budget shortfall accidentally produced one of science fiction's most enduring and most frequently imitated concepts, one that continues to inspire genuine physics research into quantum teleportation more than half a century later. The phaser, Starfleet's standard sidearm, has become instantly recognizable shorthand for futuristic weaponry in the decades since the show aired. Its origin story is considerably less glamorous than its screen presence suggests. Rather than commissioning original, sophisticated props from scratch, the show's design team started with a batch of existing plastic ray gun toys and low-budget novelty props already sitting in the studio's prop inventory, left over from earlier, unrelated productions. From there, the design team modified and dressed up these existing pieces, adding new paint jobs, extra detailing, and small mechanical additions to make them look more convincingly advanced and futuristic. Close inspection reveals the compromise. The proportions are slightly off for what is supposed to be a serious sidearm, and the plastic construction has an unmistakably lightweight, toy-like quality under harsh lighting. On camera, however, with the right angle and the right sound design layered on afterward, the illusion held perfectly. What makes this particular shortcut worth remembering is where it eventually led. The concept of a compact, handheld, adjustable energy weapon capable of both non-lethal stun settings and lethal force went on to directly influence decades of real-world directed energy weapons research, with defense researchers explicitly citing the phaser concept as a reference point for laser and microwave-based weapon systems. A dressed-up toy from a studio prop closet helped inspire real military research programs. The instrumental theme that opens every episode of the original series, composed by Alexander Courage, is one of the most recognizable pieces of television music ever written. Fewer people know that the theme technically has lyrics, words that were written specifically to be sung, and that those lyrics were never once performed or aired anywhere in the actual broadcast series. Gene Roddenberry wrote the lyrics himself, years after Courage had already composed and delivered the music. His stated justification at the time was that adding lyrics would make the piece more versatile for other uses. The actual motivation, according to accounts from people close to the production, was considerably more practical. Under music publishing rules of the era, adding a lyricist credit to an existing composition entitled that lyricist to a cut of the composer's royalties, regardless of whether the lyrics were ever used. By quietly writing a verse that nobody would ever need to sing, Roddenberry secured himself a permanent, ongoing share of royalties from a piece of music he had no hand in composing. Courage was reportedly furious when he learned what had happened, and the episode remains one of the more uncomfortable footnotes in the show's creative history. The character of Ensign Pavel Chekhov, the young, enthusiastic Russian navigator, did not appear in the show's first season at all. He was introduced at the start of the second season, and the timing lines up with a specific piece of Cold War context that rarely makes it into casual retrospectives of the show. During the first season, the Soviet press reportedly ran commentary criticizing the show for depicting a diverse, multinational future crew that somehow managed to exclude any Russian characters, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was leading major milestones in the real-world space race at the time, including the first human spaceflight. Whether that criticism was the sole driving factor or simply one contributing pressure among several, the production's decision to add a young Russian officer to the bridge crew for Season 2 fits neatly into the show's broader, very deliberate strategy of using its cast to make a statement about international cooperation during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War. Chekhov's presence on the bridge, standing shoulder to shoulder with American, Scottish, Japanese, and African characters, was never an accident of casting. It was calculated optimism, dressed up as science fiction. Nichelle Nichols played Lieutenant Uhura, the Enterprise's communications officer, and her presence on screen was quietly radical for American television in the 1960s. She was one of the first black women depicted in a major, non-servile role on a mainstream American series, portrayed not as a side character or a stereotype, but as a skilled, respected officer serving on the bridge of a starship, holding real authority in a chain of command. Despite the significance of the role, Nichols was seriously considering leaving the series after its first season, drawn by an opportunity to return to musical theater on Broadway, a field where she had built her career before joining the show. She had already prepared her resignation when a chance encounter changed everything. At an NAACP fundraising event, she was introduced to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who told her directly that he was a fan of the show and, more specifically, a fan of her character. He explained that for the